Okay, the video you're getting ready to watch is not created in support of or in response to any books, comments, or individuals' comments or individual. And I left the date on the video just as a added piece of information for those who are going to watch. And I am currently releasing the video though because of the comments and things that are out there and how they represent Jews of color, especially those of us who are quote unquote Black presenting. I believe that those who are Jews, Judean, Israelite, depending on how they tend to name themselves or give themselves a designation, those of color are needed to speak up in this moment because unfortunately, many of us will be lumped into groups based upon our skin color. And while the media is doing its job, it also hurts Jews of color within the community because those of us who don't share all of the views of those who are being headlined now are in fact being marginalized because of the information. There have been years of research done by Judeans, Israelites, and secular scholars that is accurate. And unfortunately, only the portions that are considered anti-Semitic are those that are propagated, and the portions that support the existence and the beauty of the cultures of those of us who have been scattered in the diaspora, those are being silenced and muted. And many of us have fought very, very fought very, very hard to reclaim our identity and walk in our ethno-religious identity. And so this video was put out so that there could be fruitful dialogue amongst many communities. It was created during Black History Month as an alternative narrative to the history of so-called Black peoples, which many of you know, and if you don't know at this point, is not a proper designation for a culture, class, or race, although that is a construct of people. And it's very important for this conversation to continue from under the umbrella of a lot of the things that are being said currently today. The conversation has to exist in a non-offensive manner about the rich cultural heritage that Jews of color, Israelites have and are discovering, as well as a faith that promotes love, justice, truth, and transparency. I want to make a clear statement that not only am I not anti-Semitic because I'm Semitic, I've heard that said a lot, but I'm not anti-Semitic, and the information that is put forth after you see this video, the actual video, is not anti-Semitic. It's due to cultural heritage. It's due to cultural heritage. And because I understand the atrocities of oppression as a Black presenting Yehudian, Israelite, Jew of color, I want this discussion to amplify rich cultural history and not mute or oppress any people. That is not the point at all. It is the opportunity for a fruitful dialogue outside of the context of anger, oppression, or anti-Semitism.
And I'd like to now bring up another interesting place that you're finding descendants of the Israelites, but may not necessarily be from the 10 tribes, but will also play a role. And it shouldn't be overlooked. It's a very serious scenario, is in Africa. Africa has perhaps hundreds of millions of people with this identity right now of being from the people of Israel. Does that mean they were from the 10 tribes? Likely not. We were taught by the historians and within our own traditions that when the Romans conquered Judea a few hundred years after that the tribes of Israel went into exile, perhaps millions of Judeans were sold into slavery, into Africa, into Rome, deep into Africa. And if you look now, you're seeing people who are most likely the descendants of those slaves who kept true. I'd like to bring up a few specific examples because they're going to be game changers. One of them wrote letters to Israel when it became a state. And they said, we're Israelites out in Africa. You know, everyone laughed at them and they said, African Israelites, these people are just trying to jump on the first world country bandwagon. They're living in a third world country. They got nothing. We're coming to Israel. We got innovation, technology. So they're trying to get on this train because there's such a thing called the right of return. All descendants of the Jewish people from around the world are able to move to Israel. So they said we are also. And everyone kind of laughed at them, like I said. And a few people took it serious and went out there and started studying them, learned about their culture. And a professor from Duke University went out there and did DNA testing on them. And he showed not only do they share Semitic genes from people who were in Yemen and back to the Middle East, these gentlemen, a large percent of them, have the Y chromosome to be Kohanim, to be priests. Now, if anyone who doesn't know, a priest is a specific family clan of the nation of Israel who come from Aaron, the brother of Moses, who was the first priest. And anyone descended from Aaron has the status title priest. And we found that these men in this village in South Africa called Lemba, L-E-M-B-A, carry this genetic marker to let us know that they share the same as from the Sephardic and the Ashkenaz and the population of the people in Israel today. They share the same exact DNA marker. That's mind-blowing. So everyone kind of got humbled a little bit who laughed at them and said, now what? Now what do we do about this? This could have tremendous implications. Another area in Africa you have something big happening is in Nigeria. You have the Igbo people, or Igbo, pronounced either way. There's 40 million of them, also Christians, like I spoke about before, how that could happen to the children of Israel very easily. But also a lot of them are now coming out and converting back or adopting the rules of the Torah without all the paganism that they've been practicing for hundreds of years. There's been books written about it from scholars in Nigeria, from scholars from the Jewish people. And where it gets interesting is, in America, there was a slave trade. And a lot of the slaves, a very high percentage of them, came from Western Nigerian ports. And in America today, you see a very large movement of African Americans who say that they're the real chosen people, that they're the children of Israel, they're the Judeans. So what are they just trying to create an identity for themselves because they were slaves, or is there really something here? And the answer is, most likely there is something there. And most likely, maybe that they were the original Israelites, and maybe that the Jewish people today who are white, Caucasian people came in a little bit later on. We know that some of the greatest sages of the transmission of the Torah were converts from Rome. You have a man named Onkelos who wrote a commentary on the Torah, unprecedented, that we still learn today. He was a convert. Some of the largest pillars on the transmission today were Roman converts. So here we are, we're Caucasian Jewish people, and now you have people in Africa saying that they're the real people of Israel. It can't be ruled out at all. We know they were sold into slavery. We know now that they're fulfilling prophecies by saying...
With over 100 million people worldwide identifying as being descendants of the ancient lost tribes of Israel, Rabbi Harry Rosenberg has launched a new educational platform, wokecourses.com, providing courses on this and many other very important and interesting topics. And we're very happy to be joined once again by Rabbi Harry from Jerusalem. Hello and welcome back, my friend.
Hey, thanks so much for having me back. It's a real honor to be here with you.
Well, thank you very much. Listen, you're doing such amazing work, and the story just keeps getting deeper and deeper and deeper every time we approach this topic. And I wanted to kind of start, we're talking a lot about the Lemba people today. If you could kind of put some light on the connection to the Lemba people specifically, and the tribes of Israel, and possible genetic links that are shown through a Cohen bloodline.
First of all, the Lemba historically has always self-identified as being from the children of Israel. We could discuss which tribe they're going to come from in a second, but just they had reached out to Israel in the early inception of the state. And a lot of people thought that this was a tribe just trying to jump on the bandwagon, as we've discussed in the past, saying, oh, it's so convenient for you to be from the children of Israel now that we have our own state. But then, researchers, they noticed that there's just a lot of things that the Lemba are doing, unlike other tribes around them. that really resembled the law of Moses and other customs, traditions of the Jewish people. So they sent a team of people down there to research them. And one of the people that went was Dr. David Goldstein from Duke, who was a professor. And they did DNA testing on them and showed that 10% or so of the tribe had the Cohen Y chromosome genetic marker, which would mean that these people have a population that comes from the descendants of Aaron, the brother of Moses, who was the first of the priestly class. So that was already shocking. And then when people looked into it a little more, they realized that they're building their houses and they're doing construction and funeral burials, etc., in the style of the Yemenite Jewry. And they were able to trace back and show from the Yemenite exile communities that these land came here. So some people may think that they come from the lost tribes of Israel, quote unquote, the 10 northern tribes, but it would seem they would be there from the Judean exile.
This idea, even of the diaspora of the tribes in Israel, really not specifically coming from the northern kingdom, but potentially coming from the tribe of Judah, correct? And especially, coming from Yemen, which was mainly Judeans as well, correct?
Yeah, for sure. And when you really look into it, you would notice that the 10 northern tribes, well, they call it the 10 northern tribes for a reason. The 10 tribes were in the northern half of Israel, and the tribes of Judah, Benjamin, and a little bit of Shimon were on the southern side of Israel. So when you discuss going into exile, it would make sense that the Judeans would have direct access to going into Africa. And in fact, we see through historians like Josephus and other historical documents, even in the Tanakh, there were many different waves of Judeans actually going into Africa in different periods of time, over a 2,000-year period even, including in recent times from the Portuguese Inquisition.
Right.
So yeah, it is definitely interesting.
I'm Hulda, and my pronouns are she, her. My pronouns are she, her, and that's very important because that kind of goes into our narrative for today. I am thrilled with all of the ups and downs of the nation and all the ups and downs of our global pandemic that we've dealt with. One of the things that has come out is an amount of resilience and a large amount of introspection and communal understanding. I think we've become sensitive to one another and our experiences. And I think the great reset, as I would like to call it, has allowed us to come into this space, onto this platform, to have conversations, and not just this conversation, but I hope conversations are open for other cultural experiences as well from this space. I know that's one of the driving forces of, no pun intended, but the drive work is to allow the people of the communities to begin to tell their stories, to amplify their voices and give their narrative space. And a lot of times the narratives that are marginalized are from communities of color, these disparate communities that have been disenfranchised, whether it's economically, historically, or socially, systemically, or all of those things wrapped into one space. And so to be able to come here and share as a person who has a very deep passion for just cultural understanding, but more importantly, cultural humility. I am honored to be able to sit in this space and share my cultural experience and share the cultural experience that is not very well known in this country, and definitely not very known in the Fresno community. And so sometimes we don't know what we have often in our own backyard. And so I'm very grateful, abundantly grateful for the opportunity. As an educator, I like to always start with an objective. I like to frame the conversation because I know that I will not be able to I'm going to give myself like 35 minutes to cover enough information that will satisfy the palates of the attendees. So I want to let you know where I want to focus in on. I'm going to move through the information, and I want to give time for questions. Often people speak and give narrative on certain things, and there's not enough time to dialogue and to seek understanding or to calm the cognitive dissonance that will definitely take place as you're forced to not look at the person sitting next to you as the categorizations that have happened during colonialism, but to give them space to offer their own interpretation of their cultural experience. So my objective, if I don't do anything else, I want to expose you to the diversity that exists within Black History Month. A lot of people have differing opinions about Black History Month because they're like, okay, well, I don't like this narrative, or we continually talk about this, but it takes time to move out of the shadows, as I like to call it, into this space where we can have deeper conversations. And so I want to add today an additional narrative to Black History Month, an additional part of our history that can often, that will be able to, is not often given, but that will be able to expand beyond this space, but also hopefully into a larger narrative as we begin to discuss the very, very diverse background of the Black community. I want you to walk away today with a better understanding of the effects of slavery. Not just that it happened, not that it should be forgiven or forgotten, but what happened. And today, as I won't be able to highlight every experience, but I'm going to talk from a personal experience. And that personal experience will connect pieces and give language to individuals who are trying to uncover their own narrative and their own family history regarding the transatlantic slave trade. I want you to walk away with the understanding that there were not just Africans in Africa. Africa is the size of about 3.5 to 4 United States of America, which means that there is an abundance of diversity that exists in Africa as well. Africa was a space that experienced both intracontinental, that means within the country, and intercontinental slave trading. And this goes back historically all the way to the times of the biblical text. I am going to use the Bible, and I must use the Bible because there would be no conversation about Jews had it not been for the establishment of who the children of Israel were by their creator in the biblical text. I had a little joke earlier that I made, and I said, which came first, the God or the nation? It's like the egg, right? Or the chicken. And a lot of times in a lot of different cultural experiences, the gods are birthed out of the experiences of the people. But based upon the biblical narrative, the people are based out of the love of the God. And so the scripture opens up with a very, very interesting story that's often debated, and it is the creation of the whole world, of the cosmos. Now, I am not either an old or earth or a new earther. I am neither either or. I believe in both. But what I will say is that the argument is not supposed to exist on that particular end. The reason why the narrative opens with a creation done by a higher power is that the book has a continuation of a theme. It goes from beginning to end. And the reason why the book starts off with its higher power is because at some point in that biblical narrative that many people have become acquainted with, that God of the universe is going to choose a particular people to act in the redemptive work of the whole world. And so that none of us have the ability to argue with who that is, he sets it up from the beginning that I did this all by myself. And your response to what I've done is, okay, okay, if I choose a people, then that's who I chose, and I chose them, and he gives a reason why. And he also tells them that I didn't choose the best people. I didn't choose them because they were the greatest or because they were the best so that they could boast in themselves, but they're supposed to be a representation of me on earth and my grace and my mercy and my love for humanity. They are supposed to be made in my likeness and image and continue that way. Now, as the world falls into, I would say, destruction, you see a regathering of a people, and those people come from a mixed multitude. I want to give that because this is not a singular narrative, but I'm hoping that as I share this, that you will also see yourself and your responsibility to a higher calling of what we call tikkun olam, which is universal healing in this process. So that's what I want you to walk away with. That's a lot. You're like, you gave me assignments and homework. Yes, I want to disrupt the soil of your heart for a right planting of seeds. All right, I'm going to share something on the screen, and I think I'm pretty good at Zoom. So what I have on the screen in front of you is my ancestry composition. Why would I start with myself? Because I never, ever, ever seek to marginalize anyone in the telling of this narrative. It's not to other, it's not to exclude, it's not to disrupt, it's not to disenfranchise anyone else. The scripture teaches the Jew that we also have to remember our situation. We've been in slavery historically, literally all the way back to Egypt, right? Back to the time of the Exodus, if you're not familiar. And so one of the things that the Creator told us to do is to remember how that was for us. So in telling this story, it's never to disrupt, it's never to oppress, it's never to other anyone, it's to amplify a story that hasn't been told. And my particular story begins with genetics, with DNA. So this is my ancestry report. And as you can see, it's very diverse. It's very diverse. And what I want to show you about this DNA, I'm going to give you a story through history using my particular DNA composition, is that DNA tells the story of migration. DNA also tells the story of colonialization, because each of these designations that appear on the screen in front of you were given by a power higher than the person existing in the confines of this DNA composition. And so in order to get the story behind the designation, we have to follow the historical footprint that exists in these genetics. I'm not gonna focus on all of them, but I am going to give you some grouping, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about DNA because it's a kind of a tricky basket when you start kind of getting into it. But what I will tell you is that we deal in mainly 3 constructs, and that's mainly done because of what they call scientific racism. Scientific racism is the grouping of people into races, and it's not against any particular group, but it's the grouping of people into races. And over time, it's been proven that science doesn't really tell the cultural experiences, especially when a colonizer is the one that gives those designations. And so it's, if you look online and you go to the Science magazine, or if you're really good and you can use Google Scholar, then I suggest you go there. But I pulled up an excerpt from the National Science magazine, and I thought it was befitting to use this because it talks about racial research and how it's controversial. And the person that is a huge proponent or disagrees very much with racial research in the construct of genetics is W.E. Du Bois. And I thought that was really cool because we don't really hear a lot of conversation about this civil rights leader as it pertains to race. And so W.E. Du Bois was the first to synthesize natural and social scientific research to conclude the concept of race, that race was not a scientific category. Contrary to the then dominant view, Du Bois maintained that health disparities between Blacks and whites stemmed from social and not biological inequity. And I think this is an important thing to kind of just rest with, because as I show you this information, I'm not telling everybody, now go out and, take your 23andMe and this is going to tell your complete story. It's going to take some work. It's going to take some work. But what we see here is not evidence necessarily of the conclusion, but evidence of breadcrumbs. This is a breadcrumb, and I'll show you how that trail worked out for me and my family. All right, so we have sub-Saharan Africa. So that's here, all this purple that shows up for myself. And these are the people groups that currently have been tested. And these are the areas where my DNA then agrees, or it has matches. Because of my transatlantic and through just probably some marrying, I don't know specifically where my 15.8% European comes from. So it is often suggested through my family history that some of the slaveholders that held our family, particularly because we've done this research, Judge Brodus and his family, that we also have European ancestry through the mixing during chattel slavery. Also, if you don't know the history about slavery, the British, the Spanish, Portuguese were some of the main slavers. So that could have happened during the Middle Passage and at some particular point. But what it does show is that it was very prevalent within my DNA composition, and it still shows up. And neither one of my parents or grandparents are European. So we're not just getting like half-life DNA. And then the very last part is East Asian and Indigenous American. And most people look at these numbers and go, oh, they're small, so that doesn't really count. Well, that's not really how genetic composition works. Every time you say, if I have a 50-50 chance, I always have a 50-50 chance. The odds never go down. Now you can get heads or tails, right? You can get heads 20 times in a row, but the chances are still 50-50. The genetic lottery is kind of similar to that, where you're pulling from a pool, and as long as that information is available, it just depends on who you are and how you pull from that genetic information. But what's extremely interesting about each of these is that it would not show up if there was no connection. And so I know there's a lot of people who have, especially in the African-American community, who claim Indigenous American ancestry. And they go, oh, well, it's only 1.4%. Well, it should be 0 if it wasn't true. So I think that even that small area is important. And you see there's Chinese, Thai, etc. Also down here, there's some recent ancestry in the areas of the Caribbean, specifically St. Catherine Parish in Jamaica and Cuba. I'll explain that in a little bit. But where I'm going to start this narrative, because it allows me to take the narrative back to the origins of our conversation, which is Jews as slave, is right here with the Igbo people of Nigeria. We're going to start with the Igbo people of Nigeria. I'm going to just change my slides just briefly, and then we're going to journey. Alrighty. So we're talking about the transatlantic diaspora from Jews to slaves. A lot of times, I'm not resting a lot on this. You guys know the history from slaves to African Americans to Blacks to whatever other designation we give ourselves. So I'm going to take it to the backside of that. We're going to talk about the migration into Africa, just really briefly. This is a map from the Jewish Virtual Library, and it shows the migration after what they call the siege of Jerusalem in 70 AD. Now, there are alternative narratives as to why that has happened, and I won't get into the contention of that. But after 70 AD, Rome came down and sacked Jerusalem. And they did it before the eve of Passover, at the time where there was a diversity of Jews in the land of Jerusalem. The reason why there was a plethora and a diverse group in Jerusalem is and Passover is a traveling feast. And it's biblically required that the men specifically, but the families often traveled as well, would return to the temple in Jerusalem 3 times a year. Passover is one of those traveling feasts. Now, by the time of 70 AD, we've already had some really big mishaps within the history of the Hebrews, specifically the Israelites. I say Hebrews because Hebrews come from Abraham, and there's a diversity of Hebrews. Arabs are also Hebrews. They get their ancestry from Abraham. But there's a specific line that came down from Abraham, then to Isaac, then to Jacob. And Jacob's name was changed to Israel, and those became the 12 tribes of Israel. You guys have probably heard of that in probably Sunday school, or probably in passing, or talking to some of your friends who are Jewish or who have Jewish ancestry or other Jews. And during that time, we get the 12 tribes. Those 12 tribes broke up into 2 different groups. So you got the northern tribes, which were called Israel, and you had the southern kingdom, which was called Judah. Around 2 Kings, if you're familiar with the Bible, there was the Assyrian Empire that came in, and they actually placed in Assyrian and Babylonian leadership into the land of the northern kingdom and pulled out the Israelites who were in the northern tribe. This was prophesied by the Bible that the northern tribes would be taken into captivity because of their disobedience to their creator. I told you we get into a little bit of the Bible because there's no Jews without the Bible. So I'm just give you a little bit of background. So they began scattering much, much sooner than the southern kingdom of Judah. The southern kingdom of Judah remained intact, with, of course, sprinkles of the other communities all the way into 70 AD. 70 AD. So like most people say like, BC, AD. So after Christ, for people who understand it in that context. The southern kingdom of Judah, which was mainly comprised of Judah, which is one of the tribes, Benjamin, the Levites, and then any people who dwelt in Jerusalem. So the real term Jew comes from those who dwelled in Jerusalem, those who were from the tribe of Judah, or the general construct of, the people who were in that area. They kind of got termed that. As time progressed, the term Jewish became known for all people who migrated, or mainly those who have a European Jewish ancestry, but many Jews who consider themselves Jews who were in the southern kingdom of Judah go by the term either Jew or Hebrew Israelite. So you'll see that used around, and it's still used in the land today. After the attack of the kingdom of Judah, or the southern tribe that was in Jerusalem, that also had other people and other nations and other parts of Israel in there, the people migrated. Now, this is from, like I said, the Jewish Virtual Library, and they have people migrating to Rome and to other areas. But I think one of the things that I think is very significant and that can't be overlooked is that people also migrated down into Africa. They migrated down to Africa. I don't know if you knew this, but Israel, they say it's in the Middle East, but Israel sits on the African tectonic plate. So technically, it is in Northeast Africa. I have actually taken this journey from Jerusalem all the way down into the Sinai Peninsula by car, and up through Egypt. And it is not a very long passage. It's so much of not a long passage that when the Israelites exited in the time of the Exodus, they walked. And it was supposed to be about a 2-week journey. It took them 40 years. We are hard-headed and it takes us a long time to get things, but that is what happened. So after the sack of Jerusalem in 70 AD, the people migrated into a bunch of areas, but I want to focus on here, the migration down into Africa. As the people migrated down into Africa, they came and they began to establish, settlements in different areas. I'm going to fast forward through history by thousands of years in a second right now. People traveled and they were either intracontinentally traded, specifically the Jews of that particular region. And they moved into an area that was not unfamiliar to them. I don't know if anybody is familiar with the biblical stories. Moses ends up coming from, the Middle East, as people would say, and he ends up in a place called Egypt, which is in Africa. And the same narrative is for the Messiah, the Christ, who was hidden in Africa, in African Egypt, when Herod was seeking to take that child and to end his life. So Africa was not an unfamiliar place. It's also not unfamiliar because if you follow the genealogies, which everybody I know can't stand about the Bible, but in the genealogies, there is a big mix between what we call Shemitic and Hamitic cultures. There's a big mix. We were mixing with Canaanites and the different nations around. The matriarchs of some of our kings and the nation of Israel come out of Africa. That is not a small historical fact. It is a known historical fact. So Africa was not unfamiliar, but Africa was not the home of the Jew. But over time through the conquest of European colonialism as it pertains to Catholicism, which a lot of people just generalize and call Christianity, and also the uprising of the Muslim expansion into Africa, you'll see that people were traded in and out of the country. This trade, and this is my fast forward through history, because they didn't just like walk over here in one day. It happened over a series of hundreds of years. People ended up on this coast of West Africa. You see how we got all the way almost to modern history. And along this coast of Africa, we have 4 regions. These regions are called the 4 coasts. And I'm going to try to zoom in on this map so I can kind of give you if it allows me to. Let me go back. It's not going to let me. Okay, I hope you can see it. But down here, we have what's called the Tooth Coast, the Grain Coast, the Gold Coast, and the Slave Coast. So you can only just kind of, guess. Over here, they picked up grain. Over here is the Ivory Coast. Over here is the Gold Coast, and here's the Slave Coast. I did not make up this map. I did not manipulate this map. I'm going to say that before. And this map is actually from the Library of Congress. Okay, so this is not something that just, poof, came out of thin air. And this was considered Negro land. This is what the cartographer during that time termed this place. And this was to help people know where to go pick up the goods, stolen or traded, that they were seeking to gain. I'm going to point out two particular names because I gave you two earlier, and it was the Kingdom of Judah. And I told you that within Judah, you also got Benjamin. There are other tribes that can be pointed out from here, but I want to point out those two. If you look closely at the Slave Coast, it right here on this map, and I'll share it for anybody who wants it. We can share it in the chat or later on through email. It says Kingdom of Judah on the West Coast, specifically the Slave Coast of Africa. Now, I mentioned earlier, if there is no connection, then you know what? It should not exist at all, but it does. The Kingdom of Judah, in some capacity, you can be the judge of that, migrates, whether in whole or in part, into West Africa. And this is where we have a slave port. I grabbed an excerpt from a book, and the book is called The Black Jews of Africa, History, Religion, Identity, and it's by Edith Bruder. And I'm going to read an excerpt from this book because she explains this much better than I can, and then I'm going to kind of fast forward into the next part of what we're going to talk about. This section is titled, it's on page 142, and it's titled The Igbo of Nigeria. I showed you Igbo ancestry, so I have not deviated from where I said we were going. And here she says, there are currently several self-proclaimed Jewish communities across Nigeria, and their growth is significant. Members of these Jewish communities mostly come from the Igbo group, the third largest ethnic group in the country, who live in the southeastern region of Nigeria. There are more than 25 synagogues of different sizes across the country, from Abuja to Port Harcourt. And some estimate the possibility of as many as 30,000 Igbo participating some form of Judaism. Several religions coexist in Nigeria, which accentuates regional and ethnic distinctions. Islam predominates in the north among the Hausa and Fulani, and the Protestantism and local Syncretism Christianity are most evident in the Yoruba areas in the west, while Catholicism is prevalent in the Igbo and closely related areas. Today, three categories of Igbo have linked to Judaism: the Hebrewists, who consider themselves as pre-Talmudic Jews on the basis of alleged Hebraic traditions of their forefathers; the members of the various Jewish congregations who have been striving toward Jewish recognition for some years; and finally, the Sabbatarians, who number more than 2 million and who practice a kind of Judaism while also reading the New Testament. A widespread belief among the Igbo is that prior to the arrival of British missionaries, they practiced a form of Judaism. The Igbo are currently developing versions of their tribal history that place it as a part of the Jewish diaspora, or claim that their ancestors came from Israel via the old African trade routes. According to the Igbo lore of the Iri, Niri, Ozubulu clans, Igbo groups traditionally claim descent from three particular Israelite tribes: Gad, Zebulun, and Manasseh, and called them B'nai Gath, B'nai Zebulun, and B'nai Manasseh. Manasseh is Manasseh. The Igbo compare their traditional customs, burial rites, circumcision on the 8th day, ritual slaughter of animals, exclusiveness, marriage customs, and agricultural practices with those of the ancient Israelites. I'm going to jump down a little bit. The name Igbo, or Ibu, or Ibu, or Igbo, is widely considered as a corrupt form of Ivri or Ibri Hebrew. The interpretation of the Igbo name for the supreme being, Chaku Abiyama, is God of Abraham, Shakwu means God, and Abiyama may be a derivative of Abraham. When asked where do the Igbo people come from, Chief Anwa, who at 90 years old is the oldest man of Neri clan in Igbo land, answered without hesitation, the Igbo are a people called Hebrews. They were led by a man by the name of Eri. There were troubles in their original home, so they took a ship and sailed down to Amabala River, tributary of Niger. Eri was chief. On the crossing of the Amabala River into Igbo land, he settled and established his government. They came from places where sacrifices are made. They are related to Israel. Hebrews and Israel are brothers. Originally, their name was Hebrew, but after crossing the river, they changed it to Igbo. That is very important because the next thing I'm going to show you has been handed over to Rice University. This information is compiled by Rice University, UC Berkeley, I think UC Irvine, and at one time Yale and Harvard also participated in the compilation of this information. Oh, wait, go back. If you look on the screen here, and I took an older version because I've used the database in its older construct, and unfortunately, it does not exist in this construct anymore. So I praise the creator for the ability to also search out information. I recently reached out to the director of this program at Rice University and asked for if you're familiar with this, the SPSS file, which will allow me to upload it into my own database to keep this. But this was from 2016 when they put out this information. And the reason why I'm giving this to you is because it goes with the me prodding at reasonable doubt. In the scriptures, it talks about the people of Israel keeping God's name attached to their name, the name of the creator. Most people say Yahweh, some people say Yahuwah, some people say Yahweh. Depends on, as you can see, migration, names change. Language has a lot to do with it, but in the Afro-Asiatic language, Yah is a very, very close derivation of the complete name of the creator, which means he exists. When you type it on the database, and this is the 2016 version, they have a new 2020 version, but when you type it on the database and you search names, and you type in Yah, these are the names that came up. And so you have Inya, Ya'o, Akeya, Kanya, etc. There are two things that happen when I read these names. First of all, it disrupts the narrative that these were slaves. You didn't pick up slaves, you picked up people. And these people had names. They took down their ages, their height, their sex. They knew what ship name they got on. They knew what ship name they got off. But what is even more striking is their origin. Their origin here attached to their names are, and some of them are Ibu or Hebrew. Now, a lot of this was oral information given to a person taking individuals onto slave ships like cargo. And a lot of them were from areas such as Spain and Britain who did not speak the native tongue. So this is what they heard and this is what they wrote down. You read from the chief of the tribe here that Ibu or Igbu is derived from Hebrew. So this is just a little soft information if you would like to continue down that path on how there is even written down documented information. This information exists because of slave ledgers. Nobody, no colonizer, and no one even now buys something without a receipt. This information was receipts and it was held as stocks and bonds. And this is where we get our stock market. Stock market actually comes from these individuals and this information. So we're going to take a little time and we're going to look at the transatlantic slave voyages. So once the people arrived on the coast, and this is why I said I will only be scratching a very small amount of information. Once they arrived onto the slave coast, onto the grain coast, onto the ivory coast, they were then put on ships and they were shackled and bound and they were sent off. This is and can be triggering for people. So I'll give you, there's no triggering imagery, but I think it's just what we don't know. You don't know what you don't know. So we've often been given the narrative that the slave trade only came from, and I'll press play so we can kind of get going. The slave trade only came from West Africa. But it is my family's cultural history that we boarded our particular slave ship on an island called Madagascar, which is here. And you'll see there are ships that go from there. And it's from our oral history that was not snubbed out during slavery that we went from Madagascar and we probably docked somewhere along the coast, probably stopped at the slave coast to pick up some more people. And we arrived in Holland, and then we arrived in Raleigh, in North Carolina, somewhere about Raleigh or Charleston, North Carolina, where the slave ports are. The reason why I said I would only be scratching the surface of this conversation is the statistic is about 95% of all slaves that were taken from the Horn of Africa to what they call the New World were actually placed onto the islands and in South America. I think it's about 5% of all slaves taken, I say slaves, misspeaking, all humans who had kingdoms and all humans who were autonomous from rule by either the British, Spanish, or Portuguese were actually taken into America. So less than about 5%. If you follow this interactive map, you'll see the amount of dots heading to Cuba and to Jamaica and to South America. And you see sporadically the dots going there. The reason why these numbers are very important is because in 1776, it is said that the Blacks in America and the slave trade, it's like, oh, it's all over, slavery was over. It is not over because we're in 1792 and we're in 1795 and there are still ships leaving. If you go to the transatlantic slave voyage website, you'll see that over 10 million people, and I believe that to be a gross underestimation, were taken on slave ships from Africa into South America, into the islands, and into North America. We are in 1840 and we still see ships leaving. And now you see them going less into the United States because, of course, you have the slavery being made illegal and the slave trade stopping. I go back and share my PowerPoint. Give me 1 second. Okay. See if I can, there we go. So the reason why I wanted to show you that is for a couple of reasons. I am not saying that every single person that got on a slave ship is a Jew. I'm not going to say that because that would be painting with a wide brush. But what I will tell you is that there is a diversity of Jews. And I mentioned it earlier that not just Africans were taken into the slave trade. And I think even if it was 5, even if it was 20, even if it was 100, even if it was 5,000 or 5 million, we know now through the migration that there were people who boarded those ships that were not just Africans. They weren't just a continent, because remember, Africa is a continent, not a country. So if you're saying you're an African, like where? Africa's huge, okay? And just like there are not Americans in America, but a rich and a diverse cultural experience happening here. If you go to places like San Francisco or to New York or to New Jersey, you'll have Little Italy, and you'll have Chinatown, and you'll have these different areas that exist within it's within a broader community. The same thing was true in West Africa. When people got on those ships, were forced to get on those ships and forced to leave their homes and to migrate, and were stripped of their language and of their cultural identity. You weren't just stripping Africans with a broad brush. You were stripping people from their homes and from their tribal designation. But when I talk about slaves to Jews, there were Jews who looked like Africans, who looked similar to the people on the west coast of Africa that boarded those ships. And when those people boarded those ships, they arrived here and they were sold into slavery, and their history was disrupted. The reason why this is a passionate topic, the diversity of Jews is passionate for me, is because there is a othering that happens every time we get into conversation that surrounds the skin of brown Americans. And I wrote a question down and I shared it with a Jewish study professor. And I said, Why do we not, us Jews of color, get the same opportunity to tell where we come from? The Ashkenazi Jew gets to say, oh, I come from Russia or Poland, and this is my story. But because of my skin color and the scientific racism that's attached to it, when you see me, I am still given slave designation, even though the oral history of my family, the history, although it exists in the margins of history, tell otherwise. And I spoke earlier and I said, I love the time period we're in. And that's why I love introducing myself as she, her, because I get to push a broader envelope. I get to say, hey, yes, call me based upon my designation, but don't stop there. Ask me how I ethnically, and in my case, ethno-religiously identify. I don't identify as Black. I don't identify as African American, although my skin tells a different narrative based upon the colonial conquest. But I have been told through my rich oral history that my people come from Israel. They come from Israel and were taken on slave ships, and our history was disrupted. There's also marginalization within our own communities, but then also within the Jewish community. Within the Jewish community that is heavily European, there is marginalization as well. And a lot of diasporic Jews, especially those who have experienced a transatlantic slave trade, do not get designation amongst Israel because our cultural experience is different from their cultural experience. Their cultural experience is heavily Russian, heavily German, heavily European in nature. They migrated to different areas, which means that they picked up different cultures. And because of that, the Jew that is in America and the Jew that is in the island and the Jew that exists in the Dravidian areas of India and other places are marginalized and forced to convert into what we already know that we are. And oftentimes this becomes a further marginalization for Jews of color because many of us have cultural experiences that go beyond the experience of the European Jew. A lot of Jews of color who are in America don't get Jewish ancestry validated because we've had Christian cultural experience. But it doesn't take into consideration the conversation of conversion. And the conversion to Christianity for many Blacks, as they identify in a really broad spectrum, for those who came over here, who came with cultural practices and language, they converted because at one time, up until about the 1700s, if you converted to Christianity, you were considered free. Yes, I said it. If you converted to Christianity, you were considered free. And so a lot of people changed their cultural practices that would have still been intact during that time in order to achieve freedom in this nation. Now, most people say, well, you should have fought and you should have died and you don't understand the atrocity of slavery because that narrative has also been watered down. I won't get into that because that's not my job to trigger you in that way. But I will say this, do your homework about slavery. I've seen people make decisions and do way less than to not be raped, killed, have your children stripped from you, and be traded away as cattle. And so a lot of Jews of color are marginalized or considered other or considered converts because we cannot maintain a streamline of history because we were forced not to speak to one another when we got on ships. They separated us if they caught us talking to each other. We were not allowed to read, to write, and our families were broken apart. And so the beauty of where we exist today is that we sit on the other side of that narrative. Those of us who carried the breadcrumbs and during this time have awakened, have the opportunity to now tell the stories of our ancestors that were completely muted during the slave trade. You can't wipe out everything. You can't wipe out everything. History will always reveal itself. It will jump out of the margins of pages and it will be in our face and force us to reckon. So the last part that I have, and I'll kind of skip through those because I want to have time for questions. I could go on for days. I'm not going to do that to you guys. I'm not going to do that. But the last part that I have is, and I'll kind of go into this briefly, is Deuteronomy 28 and 68. I told you earlier that there is no validation without the text. No group, no court, no nation can validate the existence of the people, because in the beginning, the creator said, it was me first, then you, right? The God came before the nation. So the God is going to be the one that's going to give the designation. I will challenge you to look at Deuteronomy 28 in a completely new light after today. And I'm going to share with you something important, because I just shared with you the migration through slave ships. And this is an article that was written in 1985, so it's old. In the world of academia, they ask you for like 10 years, but in this case, it's valid. And the part I want to point out, and this is not the context of the argument, but it is a segue into a deeper conversation. And it's the verse that says, Yahweh will cause you to return to Egypt in ships. In the beginning, I pointed out that Egypt is walking distance from Israel. So there did not necessitate a major return into ships. And even though there was ships that went from there, I'm not going to say that. I've traveled enough to know that that is true. But what we're talking about here exists in the greater context of Deuteronomy 28, which talks about the blessings and the cursings that would befall the children of Israel if they disobeyed their Elohim. Now, just like I don't go into the other stuff, I'll tell you this. It's not the Elohim's fault for the disenfranchisement of the people. It's the people's fault because they were given rules. I told you before that the people were not chosen to just be chosen. They were chosen to heal the world. And so when they stopped that job, there was a separation from their creator. And so the writer here writes that the text of Deuteronomy 28:68 contains the last of the curses upon the Israelites threatened by Moses if the people are not careful to do all the words of this law, which are written in this book. It is not difficult to find historical explanations for other of these concluding curses, especially, for example, with regard to to verse 64, where exiles among all peoples is threatened. Deuteronomy 68 has proven, however, a stubborn obstacle to interpreters. It reads, and Yahweh will cause you to return to Egypt in ships. In the way that I said to you, you shall never see it again. And you shall sell yourselves there to your enemies as male and female slaves, but there shall be no buyer. Throughout antiquity, throughout history, throughout Jewish, Talmudic, and Mishnic interpretation, people have taken their crack at this verse. Josephus took his crack at this verse. But as we sit on the other side of the historical narrative, and as we've seen the transatlantic slave trade, which is one of the greatest and most offensive things in the sight of God and man to humanity, we now sit in a position to look at the prophecy given here for disobedience and say, it could have been some European Jews selling themselves, and it could have been a couple of people selling into Egypt. But once you know, and once you've seen the transatlantic slave trade in connection with everything else that was prophesied as curses in Deuteronomy 28, there is no question that selling into the house of bondage where no man shall buy you was the transatlantic slave trade. This idea here of no man shall buy you is not the idea that no one shall purchase you. Good grief, we know that a lot of slaves are purchased. This is that no one shall come and rescue you from your disparity. It has yet to happen for those of us who are Jews who are carried into this land that we consider the land of our captivity still, with nowhere to return to because we are considered lost tribes. No book, no people, no land to go to. We have not yet been redeemed. When other nations come into this nation, whether by exile, by forced migration, there is home to go back to. The history for us has been disrupted. And even our own, who consider themselves our own, don't receive us back into the land because of our very, very grim cultural experience through the transatlantic slave trade, which sought to literally obliterate our history. I challenge you to look at Deuteronomy 28 also in conjunction with this conversation. This is important. I'm going to get to the questions. This is the last part. Baruch is considered a lost book or apocryphal book. Baruch was described for the prophet Jeremiah, where a lot of the prophecies concerning the migration and the reclamation of the children of Israel exist. The creator, the God of Israel, stated that he would call the people and claim them back from lands beyond the river Euphrates, beyond the river Nile, which goes into Africa, and from the four corners of the earth. Baruch, being the scribe of Jeremiah, has a continuation of the time period, and this is considered to be prophetic because the people were, one, getting ready to go into Babylonian captivity, but it also talks about the return from the lands where they are sent. And so this has a deeply sentimental place for a lot of us Jews who identify as transatlantic Jews. So in Baruch chapter 2, starts at verse 27, but specifically highlighting 30 and beyond. It says, O Lord our God, thou hast dealt with us after all thy goodness, and according to all that great mercy of thine, as thou spakest by thy servant Moses in the day when thou didst command him to write the law before the children of Israel, saying, if you will not hear my voice, surely this very great multitude shall be turned into a small number among the nations, where I will scatter them. For I knew that they would not hear me, because it is a stiff-necked people, but in the land of their captivity they shall remember themselves, and shall know that I am the Elohim, their Yah, or the Lord their God, for I will give them a heart and ears to hear. And they shall praise me in the land of their captivity, and think upon my name, and return from their stiff neck and from their wicked deeds, for they shall remember the way of their fathers, which sinned before Yah, or before the Lord. It was prophesied that we, although disrupted, although broken away from our history, would remember ourselves, not just any place, not when we return, but we remember ourselves in the land of our captivity. So the last thing we have here is shalom. I put shalom up there. And I think it's a really good conversation because we're in Black History Month, and I'm not going to get on reparations, but I'm going to talk about shalom. And shalom is the idea, is the practice, is the action of peace. Without reparation, which is the idea of returning something, or giving something back, or correcting something, there won't be peace. And so most people say, well, what was the point of this? Why? So that in the restoration and in the reclamation, there can be peace, not only historical peace, but also peace within the nations where our people have been scattered to. I know there is a big call for reparations, and I'm not against it. I stand for whatever is due to the people who have experienced the atrocities of slavery. But as an educator, I am going to add to that conversation the call of the reparation of identity and knowledge. We need more opportunities to tell our marginalized story. We need more opportunities to not sit within the recesses of and the shadows of Black culture, which seeks to marginalize and mute our narrative again. It's like sitting at the bottom of a slave ship again, shackled mentally now, not able to speak out because it's not politically correct, or well, we've never heard that before. That's not what we want to hear anymore. We want peace, and the peace that we seek is for our rich cultural identity to no longer exist fragmented and disparate, spread out like the transatlantic slave trade. We would like our narrative to become an option for our people, because the narrative that's been given stops in the slave fields and in the sugarcane fields and on the west coast of Africa. But history doesn't just pick up somewhere, it's a continuation. And had we willingly given up that history, then I would say c'est la vie. But because we didn't, and because it was taken from us, we would like the opportunity to continue research, to continue to have the conversation. And if there's any funding that's needed, it's in the furthering of that narrative and conversations, not only for us, but for other individuals who are forced into these designations of Black, white, non-Hispanic, Hispanic. That is not enough. It's not enough to tell the experiences that we've had, whether we've come from South America, North America, Europe, India, from the islands. We need space to tell our stories uninterrupted. I'll end with this, Isaiah 12, sorry. And it says, and he shall set up an ensign for the nations and shall assemble the outcasts of Israel and gather together the dispersed of Judah from the four corners of the earth. Jews have been spread all over, and it is time for our narrative to be included into what exists now as Jewish history. That's all I have. So ethnic groups come with a culture, with practices, with language. So that would give you the ethnic part of it. And then the religious is the religion part of it. Now, I want to answer as directly as I possibly can without marginalizing or offending anyone. But when it comes to the religion of the Bible, it didn't start off as Judaism. Judaism is a later development of religious practice, and it has within it embedded deep connection to the Torah. But as I talked about earlier, in migration, there are things that are picked up. There are different groups who consider themselves Jewish who have more strict or rigid belief systems, and they don't necessarily consider themselves fully Jewish. In the sense, Jewish. They don't consider it just Judaism. One of those groups is the Karaite Jews, where they exist and they believe the Torah only. And so within the spectrum of diversity of Jews, not necessarily belief systems, but things that have been picked up along the way. And so to kind of get to that ethno-religious and how that comes together is because there is really, truly no difference in the ethnicity and the religion, the culture and the religion of a Jew. There should not be a difference. Now, today we have different nations. A person can term themselves and frame that however they want, but you have secular Jews. These are Jews who they identify as a group who is attached tribally or through, migration to the Israelites, but they don't practice. But a true Jew is a Jew that practices Torah as well. And there's a really big movement amongst Jews, especially Jews of color, to returning back to the practices, because in the practices, for the Jew that identifies as a Jew, in the practices, there is also blessing that comes with it. It comes in a universal principle. It teaches us to love and to be good one to one another, to guard the earth. And so that's why it's ethno-religious, because the religion is part of our culture. It is our culture. We really don't have a religion. It's called ethno-religious because it makes sense, in English, but really a Jew is a Jew who is one in totality. Is there a such thing? Yes, there is a such thing as conversion. Now, the conversion process obviously is going to look different based upon those cultural differences. So if it's in the Orthodox tradition of Judaism, then there is a cultural practice of conversion that exists within that spectrum. But if we stick strictly with the biblical text, a person who is crossing over or converting begins to do the practices and then joins themselves with the people of those practices. So the Bible talks about there's no different law for the stranger or the homeborn. So that means that all the way across the board, that law is the same, and it exists under the complete umbrella of a universal law, because the law is to benefit humanity. The creator of the universe is saying, hey, I made your body. I made these things. This is how they work. And so that is how the creator would see it. Of course, man, when we put our hands to things, we begin to do things that cause a bit of marginalization, where you have to do it like this and you have to do it by this. I am a practicing Jew who believes in sticking as close as possible to the way that the creator says it. So when a person wants to join in with the family or with the greater community of Jews, as I experience Jews as a transatlantic Jew, that comes in practice. that comes in the doing, not in just a time period where I say these words or I do this thing and then now I'm in, but it comes with a continuation and cultivation of relationship with the creator. I think that's it's a very good question, because I think part of a lot of the contention regarding who is and who is not a Jew is surrounding skin color. And I don't tell people this, and I'm going to say it this way. It's kind of like a colloquialism. So like, God isn't petty. So he's not looking at people and saying, ooh, you're not brown enough. And oh, you're too brown. And oh, like that's not even within his spectrum of mind frame, if I can even speak into that infinite space. So we know throughout history that people migrated. In my travels, I went to the British Museum, and one of the things that I learned there was that during the time period of, in the early BCs, like in the late, I'm sorry, that a lot of the people had already mixed. The Greeks who had came in, they carried away Israelite women, they killed the men, they took them into Europe, which is why the Jewish culture is very matrilineal for those who have that connection. And so while being swarthy may be a thing I've read in some of the like the books or in some of the maritime even journals, or the people who were, coming and picking up different people and would identify them as Jews, they would talk about their skin tone if they were in a particular region. And so I think migration has a lot to do with it. I feel like in some ways it's in the infinite wisdom of the creator as well, that we were spread a lot of places. Now, one of the things that makes being a transatlantic Jew very interesting is that we experience racism very heavily in this country, not so much in the sense, I'm talking about racism where you could not marry a person, you could not, you would be killed if you were with it. So our intermixing in this nation was very limited, where in other places it wasn't, where like a lot of our brothers and sisters who are in like South America have Portuguese roots. So they may have wavier hair, they may identify as Puerto Rican or Belizean or other. And so those are some of the things that happened over time. So imagine if you were migrating into Assyria, which is what they call Indo-Eurasian, right? Or into European areas, then you would have had a less likelihood of intermixing with other people of color, which would leave those Jews of color with a more European visage, where the Jews of color who went into areas where people are colored would then retain their color. Now, our practices are what marginalized us no matter where we went. So whether we were in Indonesia, whether we were in India, even on the coast of Africa, we were picked up to be, sent off because we weren't native to those areas. So yes, we have been marginalized by skin color. And of course, if you go anywhere and you see the people who are different types of Jews all over, then you'll see marginalizations because of cultural practices as well. So can you just look at a person and say, because you're brown, you're a Jew? I believe it takes a spiritual process as well. I believe that when you identify and do the practices, and you are in one of those marginalized groups, it's a lot easier to tell you apart. It's an amazing question. And I think the best place to start, and I know this sounds so elementary, but you got to start reading. I think that's one of the things that has been a big issue within the so-called Black community as a whole, is that we are not reading to know for ourselves. We listen, we hear people speak, we don't follow that information further than that. But I believe that there is, the Bible talks about eternity being bound up in the heart of man. Whether you identify as a Hebrew or not, and this is just my personal belief system, I believe all of us have an internal thing that tugs us toward the Creator, however you identify him. And to understand him and to know him, or however you designate that, is something that you have to journey into. I believe that when we walk, that the Creator, the higher power, is going to meet us wherever we are and help us on that journey. The scripture, as I read it, says that you'll find me when you seek me with your whole heart. And so I think part of that is reading, seeking to understand, thinking. It is not a crime to think. I think one of the greatest gifts we have as transatlantic Jews and as just children of the diaspora and African Americans is the ability to free think now. Think for yourselves, challenge the narratives. And so for those who are seeking to practice, I believe a good place to start is to pray and to read. And then I believe that your tribe will find you. Your tribe will definitely find you. It is so true. I see somebody put the Torah as the first 5 books of the Bible. Yes. And it's not just the law devoid of anything good. It is literally universal practices that have withstood the test of time and create a community where we can coexist. All right. So Shema Yisrael, Yah Eloheinu, Yah Echad, Va'ahavta et Yah Elohecha b'chol levavcha, uv'chol nafshecha, uv'chol meodecha. V'hayu hadivarim ha'ele asher anochi, metzuvecha hayom al levavcha. Veshenantam lebanecha vidabarta bam, veshevtecha bevetecha ulektecha bederek. Ukumecha, ukshubecha, ukshartam, leot al yadecha, vahayu letotafot benenecha, uktavtam al mezuzot beitecha, uvisharecha. Shalom Aleichem, and I hope you guys have an amazing rest of your Thursday. Thank you so much for joining us.